The mountain air hung heavy with anticipation as the old gravel road wound its way through the dense forest of the Adirondacks, each twist and turn holding memories of a bond that defied nature itself. Mark Stevens, a former Marine Scout sniper, had heard the impossible stories from locals about a massive brown bear that appeared like clockwork every sunset near his old cabin, waiting motionless for hours as if expecting someone to return. What the townspeople didn't know was that this wasn't just any bear. This was Thunder, the orphaned cub he had saved during his darkest days after returning from Afghanistan. And now, 4 years later, he was finally coming home. The late autumn wind whispered through the towering pines, carrying with it the earthy scent of fallen leaves and the promise of early snow. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple as Mark's weathered pickup truck crawled along the familiar path. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension, while his wife Racel watched him from the passenger seat, her green eyes filled with a mixture of concern and hope. Their daughter Emily, now 12, sat in the back seat, her nose pressed against the window as she searched the tree line. She had been just 8 when they left the cabin, when Thunder was barely more than a clumpy furred youngster learning to forage. Back then, the bear had been their miracle, appearing in their lives just when Mark needed it most, when the nightmares and memories of war threatened to tear him apart. The cabin emerged from the forest like a memory taking physical form. Its cedar walls had weathered to a distinguished gray, the metal roof catching the last rays of sunlight like burnished copper. The front porch, where Mark had spent countless hours sitting with Thunder, remained solid and welcoming, though the rocking chair he'd left behind now lay toppled on its side, a testament to years of abandonment. "It looks exactly the same," Racel whispered, reaching over to squeeze Mark's arm. Her touch anchored him, just as it had during those first difficult months after his return from deployment. The cabin had been their sanctuary then, a place to heal, to rebuild, to find peace in the quiet moments between darkness and dawn. Emily leaned forward between the seats, her long brown hair falling around her face like a curtain. "Do you think he'll still be here, Dad? Do you think Thunder really waited all this time?" The hope in her voice made Mark's chest tighten. He had asked himself the same question 1,000 times since hearing the stories, since making the decision to return. Mark pulled the truck to a stop in front of the cabin, the engine's rumble fading into the evening silence. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting. He checked his watch, 5:47 p.m. According to the locals, Thunder always appeared just as the sun began to set, emerging from the tree line to take up his vigilant post near the old fire pit where they used to sit together. "Stay in the truck for now," Mark instructed, his military training kicking in automatically. Even though Thunder had been gentle with them years ago, 4 years was a long time for a wild animal. The bear would be fully grown now, possibly weighing over 1,000 pounds. The thought made his heart race, not with fear, but with a strange mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. Racel reached for his hand again, her fingers intertwining with his. "We're here with you," she said softly, understanding as always. She had been the one who supported his decision to rescue Thunder in the first place, who had seen how caring for the orphaned cub had helped heal something broken inside him. The memories flooded back as Mark stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel. He remembered the day he had found Thunder, tiny and alone, his mother likely killed by poachers. The cub had been struggling, weak and frightened, but something in his eyes had called to Mark. Perhaps it was the same lost look he saw in his own reflection each morning, the same fighting spirit that refused to give up. The air grew colder as the sun continued its descent, shadows lengthening across the clearing. Mark moved slowly toward the fire pit, his steps deliberate, measured. The old logs they had used as seats were still there, though now covered in moss and weathered by countless storms. He could almost see Thunder as he was then, awkwardly learning to catch fish in the nearby stream, playing with Emily in the yard, sleeping peacefully on the porch, while Mark kept watch through the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. A twig snapped in the forest, the sound sharp and clear in the evening quiet. Mark's body tensed instinctively, his senses heightened just as they had been in the mountains of Afghanistan. But this wasn't a combat zone. This was home, or at least it had been. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to stay calm as he scanned the tree line. Emily pressed her face against the truck window, her breath fogging the glass. Racel sat perfectly still, one hand resting protectively on their daughter's shoulder. The moment stretched out, filled with possibility and the weight of 4 years of absence. Then came the rustling, deliberate and heavy, from the direction of the old trail they used to walk together. Mark's heart thundered in his chest as the underbrush began to move. A shadow emerged, massive and powerful, exactly where the locals said it would appear. Thunder had grown enormous, his brown fur thick and glossy, muscles rippling beneath his winter coat. He moved with the quiet confidence of an apex predator, but there was something else in his bearing, something almost regal. The bear paused at the edge of the clearing, his head raised, testing the air. Mark stood completely still, hardly daring to breathe. Thunder's nose twitched and suddenly his head turned, dark eyes focusing directly on Mark. The recognition was instant, impossible, miraculous. The bear's entire demeanor changed, his powerful, body relaxing, head lowering slightly in the same way it used to when they would sit together on peaceful evenings. "Hey, big guy," Mark said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Been a while, hasn't it?" Thunder took a step forward, then another, moving with surprising gentleness for a creature of his size. Mark remained motionless, remembering all the times they had sat together, all the nights when Thunder's presence had kept the darkness at bay. The bear approached slowly, deliberately, until he was close enough that Mark could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his massive frame. Inside the truck, Emily made a small sound of wonder, and Racel's, hands pressed against the window, tears streaming down her face. They had all changed in the past 4 years. Mark's hair had started to gray at the temples. Emily had grown from a child into a young woman. Racel's face had gained new lines of wisdom. But something fundamental remained, unchanged, unbreakable. Thunder stopped just a few feet away from Mark, his head level with Mark's chest. The bear's breath came out in visible puffs in the cooling air, his eyes never leaving Mark's face. Slowly, with infinite care, Thunder lowered himself to sit on his haunches, exactly as he used to do when they would share quiet moments together. Mark's legs trembled as he carefully lowered himself onto one of the old logs. Thunder watched him, patient and alert, his presence both familiar and awe-inspiring. The bear's size was intimidating, but his demeanor remained gentle, almost protective. He was no longer the clumsy cub who had needed saving. He had become a guardian of this place, keeping vigil for the family that had once given him a home. The sun continued its descent behind the mountains, painting the clearing in soft golden light. Neither man nor bear moved, each seemingly content to simply be in the other's presence, after so long apart. In the truck, Emily whispered something to Racel, who nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. Mark's thoughts drifted to the days after finding Thunder, how caring for the orphaned cub had given him purpose when he needed it most. The bear had needed him then, had depended on him for survival, but perhaps Mark had needed Thunder even more. In those quiet moments together, when the weight of war pressed heavily on his shoulders, Thunder's uncomplicated presence had been a lifeline, a reminder that healing was possible, that life continued even after unimaginable loss. The clearing was growing darker now, the first stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the sky. Thunder shifted slightly, his massive head turning toward the truck where Racel and Emily waited. His nostrils flared again, taking in their familiar scents, and something in his posture softened even further. Mark glanced at his watch again. Nearly an hour had passed, though it felt like mere minutes. According to the locals, Thunder never stayed longer than sunset. Always, disappearing back into the forest until the next evening. But tonight was different. Tonight, the long wait was over. "They've missed you too," Mark said quietly, standing slowly. Thunder rose with him, his movements careful and deliberate. Mark took a small step backward toward the truck, and the bear followed, maintaining the same respectful distance. It was time for the family to be whole again, time for new memories to join the old. Racel watched through the windshield as Mark gestured slowly toward the truck, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Thunder's massive frame moved with surprising grace as he followed Mark's lead, his dark eyes intelligent and focused. Emily gripped her mother's arm tightly, barely breathing as the enormous bear approached their vehicle. "He remembers," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Mom, he really remembers us." The setting sun cast long shadows across the clearing as Mark carefully opened the passenger door. Racel could smell the crisp mountain air mixing with the earthy scent of pine needles and approaching winter. Thunder stood perfectly still, his head slightly tilted as he watched them, steam rising from his nostrils in the cooling evening air. "Easy now," Mark said softly, extending his hand to help Racel from the truck. Her legs felt unsteady as she stepped onto the gravel, memories flooding back of countless evenings spent watching Mark and Thunder together on the porch. The bear had been so much smaller then, still learning to navigate the world without his mother. Thunder took a single step forward, then lowered his head in a gesture so familiar it brought tears to Racel's eyes. It was the same motion he would make when approaching them for breakfast in the mornings, gentle and respectful despite his size. Now that size was truly magnificent. His shoulders stood higher than Mark's waist, his head massive and powerful. Emily remained in the truck, vibrating with excitement but waiting for permission. Mark nodded to her, and she slowly opened her door, moving with the careful deliberation they had always used around Thunder. The bear's ears twitched at the sound, but his body remained relaxed, his eyes moving between the three humans as if confirming they were all really there. "Look how big he got," Emily breathed, staying close to her mother's side. Her voice carried the same wonder it had years ago when they would watch Thunder learning to fish in the stream or climbing trees in the yard. "Do you think he's been okay out here by himself?" Racel studied the bear more closely. Despite living fully wild for 4 years, Thunder's coat was healthy and thick, his body strong and well-fed. The locals had mentioned leaving fish and berries near the cabin sometimes, touched by the bear's faithful vigil. But clearly, Thunder had learned to thrive in the wilderness, while maintaining his connection to this place. The family stood together. Now Mark, slightly in front of Racel and Emily, though Thunder showed no signs of aggression. The bear moved with deliberate slowness, each step careful and measured as he approached Emily. Racel felt her daughter tremble slightly, not with fear, but with the effort of containing her excitement. "Hi, Thunder," Emily said softly, her voice carrying the same gentle tone she had used when he was a cub. The bear's response was immediate. His ears perked forward, and he made a low, rumbling sound deep in his chest. It was a sound Racel remembered well, one they had heard countless times during peaceful evenings on the porch. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of snow. The first flakes began to fall, tiny crystalline specks drifting lazily in the fading light. Thunder lifted his head, nose twitching as he caught the changing scent of the air. Racel remembered how fascinated he had been by snow as a cub, pawing at the flakes and rolling in fresh drifts. "We should get inside," Mark said, glancing at the darkening sky. "Storms coming in faster than expected." He looked at Thunder, who remained focused on their every movement. "Want to come home, big guy?" The bear's response surprised them all. Without hesitation, Thunder turned and walked toward the cabin's porch, his massive frame moving with purpose. He stopped at the steps, looking back at them expectantly, exactly as he used to do when he was ready for their evening routine to begin. Racel felt a laugh bubble up in her chest, the sound carrying a release of tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Even after 4 years, Thunder remembered. He remembered everything. Mark retrieved their bags from the truck, while Racel and Emily followed Thunder to the porch. The bear waited patiently as Mark unlocked the cabin door, the key turning with some resistance after years of disuse. Inside, the air was stale but familiar, filled with memories of happier times. Thunder remained on the porch as they entered, his bulk filling the doorway as he watched them move around the cabin. Racel began opening windows despite the cold, letting in fresh air and the sound of wind in the pines. Emily moved to the fireplace, running her hands over the river rocks that formed the hearth where Thunder used to lay on cold nights. "It's like stepping back in time," Racel said, looking around at the furniture they'd left covered with sheets. The cabin had been their healing place, where Mark had slowly found his way back to himself after the war, where Thunder had helped bridge the gap between the soldier Mark had been and the man he needed to become. The bear's presence on the porch seemed to complete something, filling a void they hadn't fully acknowledged until this moment. Mark moved with purpose, uncovering furniture and pulling supplies from their bags. The cabin had basic utilities. They'd never fully shut them off, always harboring a quiet hope of return. Thunder watched through the doorway as Racel and Emily worked together to make up the beds with fresh linens they'd brought. His dark eyes followed their movements, alert but peaceful, as if ensuring they were settling in properly. The snowfall was growing heavier outside, the flakes now thick and wet. "He can't stay out there in this weather," Emily said, looking worriedly at the darkening sky. The temperature was dropping rapidly, the wind picking up strength as the storm moved in. Thunder showed no sign of discomfort, his thick fur well suited to mountain winters, but the thought of him returning to the forest tonight seemed wrong. Mark nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The porch is covered. If he wants to stay, he can. Stay." He looked at Thunder, who remained stationed in the doorway, What do you say, buddy? Want to keep watch like old times? The bear's response was to slowly lower himself onto the porch boards, his massive body settling into a comfortable position that still allowed him to see into the cabin and out into the clearing. It was exactly where he used to sleep, though. Now his size made the porch seem much smaller. Racel moved to the kitchen, pulling out the camping stove they'd brought since the cabin's utilities would need checking before they used them. The familiar routine of preparing dinner felt surreal, with Thunder's massive presence just outside the door. She could see Mark watching the bear, his face filled with a complex mixture of emotions. "I never thought we'd have this again," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her at the counter. "When we left, it felt like giving up, like I was abandoning him just like everything else." Racel leaned into him, understanding the weight of those words. They'd left the cabin because Mark had finally been ready to rejoin the world, to return to their life in the city and face the challenges of reintegration. But leaving Thunder had been the hardest part, even though the bear had grown strong enough to survive on his own. Emily sat near the door, alternating between unpacking her backpack and watching Thunder. The bear's eyes were heavy-lidded now, content and peaceful as snowflakes gathered on his fur. The scene was both familiar and entirely new. Their daughter was no longer the small child who had played under Thunder's watchful eye, and Thunder was no longer the clumsy cub who had needed their protection. The storm continued to build outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of warmth was growing. The camping stove hissed softly as Racel prepared a simple dinner, the scent of cooking food mixing with the fresh mountain air. Thunder's breathing had grown deep and regular, though his ears still twitched at every sound from within the cabin. "Do you think he'll still be here in the morning?" Emily asked, her voice small against the growing sound of wind in the trees. "What if he disappears again?" Mark moved to sit beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Thunder's home now, just like we are. Sometimes you have to trust that the things that matter find their way back to you." Racel watched them, father and daughter, silhouetted against the gathering darkness beyond the door. Thunder's massive form provided a sense of protection, a guardian returning to his post after a long absence. The bear's loyalty, his patient vigil over the years, seemed to heal something that had remained broken since their departure. The snowfall grew heavier, creating a white curtain that obscured the forest beyond the clearing. Thunder's dark fur was now dusted with white, but he seemed content, his body relaxed as he guarded their threshold. The scene was peaceful, perfect, as if the past 4 years had been merely a pause in their story rather than an ending. The night deepened as the storm enveloped the mountain, transforming the familiar landscape into a swirling canvas of white. Inside the cabin, the camping lanterns cast a warm glow across the wooden walls, creating dancing shadows that reminded Racel of those first nights with Thunder, when he was just a frightened cub seeking shelter from his own storms. Mark sat in, his old spot by the window, his military-trained eyes scanning the darkness beyond the porch, out of habit. Thunder's massive form remained a constant presence at the doorway, his steady breathing a counterpoint to the wind's howling. The bear's fur had collected a thick layer of snow, but he seemed unbothered, his dark eyes reflecting the lantern light as he kept his vigilant watch. Emily had spread her sleeping bag near the fireplace, though she showed no signs of tiredness. Her attention remained fixed on Thunder, as if afraid he might vanish if she looked away too long. Racel understood the feeling. There was something dreamlike about the entire evening. a sense that they had stepped through time into a moment that shouldn't have been possible. "Do you remember," Emily said suddenly, her voice soft against the storm's backdrop, "when Thunder first learned to catch fish? How he'd splash around in the stream for hours, getting soaked but never catching anything?" Mark's face softened with the memory, until that one day when he finally got it, came proudly walking up to the porch with this tiny trout, looking like he'd just conquered the world. Racel moved to join them, carrying mugs of hot chocolate made on the camping stove. The familiar scent seemed to catch Thunder's attention. His nose twitched, and he lifted his head slightly, watching as she distributed the drinks. Years ago, they'd sometimes let him lick a little whipped cream from their fingers, a treat he'd accepted with surprising gentleness. "He used to wake us up every morning," Emily continued, warming her hands around the mug, "scratching at the door right at sunrise, ready for breakfast and adventures." She paused, her expression growing thoughtful. "Do you think that's what he's been doing all this time? Coming back every day, waiting for us to open the door?" The question hung heavy in the air, carrying the weight of 4 years of absence. Racel watched as Mark's hands tightened around his mug, saw the shadow of guilt cross his face. They had all carried that burden, the knowledge that somewhere in these mountains, Thunder might be waiting, might be wondering why his family had disappeared. A particularly strong gust of wind rattled the windows, making the lantern light flicker. Thunder's ears twitched at the sound, but he remained relaxed, his massive body a barrier between the storm and his reunited family. The bear's presence felt both miraculous and somehow inevitable, as if all paths had been leading back to this moment. The locals said he never bothered anyone, Mark said, his voice thoughtful. Just showed up every evening, sat in the same spot, waited until dark. Some of them started leaving food out for him, worried he'd go hungry. He shook his head, amazement clear in his expression. 1,000-pound wild bear, and they were leaving him care packages like a worried neighbor. Racel remembered the day they'd left, how Thunder had watched their truck disappear down the mountain road. They'd told themselves it was the right thing to do. He was old enough to survive on his own, and Mark needed to continue his recovery in the city. But none of them had truly recovered from the separation. When Mrs. Henderson from the General store called, Racel said softly, telling us about the bear that kept faithful watch, I almost couldn't believe it. But somehow, I knew it had to be him. No other bear would show that kind of loyalty, that kind of patience. Thunder shifted on the porch, adjusting his position to keep a better view of both the cabin interior and the storm-swept clearing. His movements, despite his enormous size, maintained the same careful gentleness they remembered. He was still their Thunder, even after years of wild mountain living. Emily moved closer to the door, staying just inside the threshold. Thunder turned his head to watch her, his eyes reflecting an intelligence that had always set him apart. I used to dream about him, she admitted, about coming back here and finding him waiting. But I was afraid he'd be different, that he wouldn't remember us, or that he'd turned completely wild. Mark joined her at the door, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. Some bonds go deeper than time or distance, he said, his voice carrying the wisdom earned through loss and redemption. Thunder wasn't just a bear we helped, he was the one who helped us, who showed us how to be a family again when everything felt broken. Racel remembered those early days after Mark's return from Afghanistan. The nightmares that had plagued him, the way he'd withdraw into himself, unable to bridge the gap between war and peace. Finding Thunder, that helpless cub fighting for survival. had given Mark a purpose beyond his own healing. In caring for the bear, he had found his way back to himself, back to them. The storm continued to intensify, the wind driving snow against the cabin walls with increasing force. Thunder remained unmoved, his broad back dusted white, his breath creating small clouds in the cold air. He was no longer the vulnerable cub they had rescued. He had become a guardian, a protector of the place where his family had once found healing. "We should try to get some sleep," Racel suggested, noting how the long day of travel and emotion had begun to show on Mark and Emily's faces. "Thunder's not going anywhere tonight." The bear's ears twitched at the sound of his name, and he made that familiar low rumbling sound in his chest, the one that had always meant contentment. Emily smiled, recognizing it immediately. "He still purrs like a giant cat," she said, wonder in her voice. Mark began setting up their sleeping bags, while Racel secured the camping stove and supplies. The cabin's familiar creaks and settling sounds mixed with the storm's symphony, creating a cocoon of comfort around them. Thunder's massive presence in the doorway completed the sense of security, as if the years of separation had been merely a brief interruption in their shared story. Emily arranged her sleeping bag where she could see Thunder clearly, though Racel noticed she was fighting to keep her eyes open. The excitement of the day, the emotional reunion, and the long drive up the mountain were finally catching up with her. Even Mark's movements had grown slower, his military alertness softening in the presence of Thunder's protective watch. "Keep thinking about all those sunsets," Mark said quietly as they settled into their own sleeping bags. 4 years of them, and he never gave up hope, never stopped believing we'd come back. Racel reached for his hand in the growing darkness, feeling the slight tremor that ran through it. "Maybe he knew something we didn't," she whispered. Maybe he understood that sometimes the longest journeys lead us right back where we need to be. Thunder's breathing had grown deeper, though his ears remained alert to every sound from the forest beyond. The storm's fury seemed to fade into the background, creating a peaceful bubble around the cabin and its reunited inhabitants. In the soft lantern light, Racel could see the contented expression on Emily's face as she finally drifted off to sleep. One hand stretched toward the door, where Thunder kept his faithful watch. The bear's silhouette filled the doorway, his massive frame, a living shield between his family and the world outside. He had grown from a vulnerable cub into a powerful guardian, yet had somehow maintained the gentle soul that had first drawn them together. In his patient vigil over the years, Thunder had kept alive not just the memory of their time together, but the possibility of their return. Dawn crept over the mountains with hesitant fingers, the storm having exhausted itself sometime in the night. Racel woke first, her internal clock still set to city rhythms despite the profound silence of the mountain morning. The first thing she noticed was Thunder, still at his post, his massive form outlined by the growing light. The bear's eyes were alert, watching the tree line as snow continued to fall in gentle flurries. Mark stirred beside her, his body tensing momentarily before relaxing as recognition settled in. 20 years of military service had left their mark, but Thunder's presence seemed to ease the transition between sleep and wakefulness. The bear turned his head slightly, acknowledging their movement with a quiet rumble. Emily remained curled in her sleeping bag, her face peaceful in the pale morning light. Small drifts of snow had collected on the porch around Thunder, but he appeared unbothered by the cold, his thick winter coat providing ample protection against the mountain weather. He stayed, Mark whispered, his voice rough with sleep and emotion. All night, through the whole storm. He moved carefully to sit up, his eyes never leaving the bear's powerful form. Thunder watched him with that same intelligent gaze they remembered, patient and aware. Racel began quietly preparing their camping stove for coffee, the familiar routine grounding her in this surreal morning. The bear's ears twitched at every small sound she made, but his body remained relaxed, as if he had simply resumed a duty that had never really ended. Outside, the forest was transformed by the overnight snowfall. The clearing sparkled pristinely, unmarked, except for a single set of massive tracks leading to the porch, Thunder's arrival path from the previous evening. The morning light caught the ice crystals hanging from the trees, creating a landscape that seemed almost ethereal. "We should check the generator," Mark said softly, moving to pull on his boots. "Get some real heat in here." Thunder shifted slightly, making room for Mark to step onto the porch while maintaining his protective position. The bear's behavior was so familiar, yet now scaled to his impressive adult size. Racel watched as Mark made his way through the snow to the generator shed, Thunder's head turning to track his movement. The bear's protective instincts were clearly intact, his attention divided between Mark's activity and the silent forest around them. Emily began to stir, her eyes fluttering open to find Thunder still guarding the doorway. A smile spread across her face, relief and joy mixing in her expression. "You're really here," she murmured, and the bear turned to look at her, making that gentle rumbling sound they all remembered so well. The morning unfolded with a strange mixture of familiarity and newness. Mark got the generator running, bringing warmth and light to the cabin. Thunder remained at his post, occasionally shifting position but never straying far from the door. His presence felt both miraculous and natural, as if he had been waiting for this exact morning to resume his role in their lives. Racel began unpacking their supplies, setting up the cabin for a longer stay than they had initially planned. The bear watched her movements with interest, his nose twitching at the scent of food emerging from their bags. Years ago, they had been careful to teach him not to beg, and remarkably he maintained that respectful distance. "Do you think he's hungry?" Emily asked, pulling on her winter coat. "Maybe we could leave something for him, like the locals did." She looked at Thunder thoughtfully, studying his healthy appearance. "Though he seems to have done pretty well for himself." Mark returned from another trip to the truck, carrying the last of their supplies. "He's definitely been taking care of himself," he agreed, noting the bear's muscled frame and thick coat. "But I think we might have something he'd appreciate." From one of the bags, Mark retrieved a jar of honey, Thunder's favorite treat from years ago. The bear's reaction was immediate. His nose lifted, nostrils flaring as he caught the familiar scent. His eyes followed the jar with an intensity that made Racel smile, remembering how they used to use honey to teach him gentle manners. "Some things never change," she said softly, watching as Mark carefully approached Thunder with the jar. The bear remained perfectly still, displaying the same patience he had learned as a cub. Only his nose twitched eagerly as Mark opened the jar and placed it within reach. Thunder waited for Mark to step back before moving to investigate the offering. Despite his enormous size, his movements were delicate as he explored the treat. The sight of such a massive predator showing such careful restraint was remarkable, a testament to the deep bond that had survived their years apart. Emily watched in fascination as Thunder enjoyed his breakfast, his powerful jaw working carefully around the jar. He still has the same table manners, she observed with delight. Remember how long it took to teach him not to grab things? The memory brought a smile to Mark's face. Weeks of patience and more than a few destroyed picnics, he recalled, watching, as Thunder finished the honey with the same meticulous care he'd learned as a youngster. But he was always smart, always willing to learn. The morning sun continued to rise, melting small patches of snow from the trees and creating a gentle mist that rose from the forest floor. Thunder finished his treat and resumed his watchful position, though his eyes now held a contentment that seemed to reflect their own feelings. Racel began preparing their own breakfast on the now functioning stove, the cabin slowly warming as the generator hummed steadily. The familiar sense of coffee and cooking food filled the air, mixing with the crisp mountain morning in a way that felt perfectly right. "We need to check the water lines," Mark said, studying the cabin's interior. "Make sure nothing froze during the winter, and the roof probably needs inspection after that storm." He spoke with purpose, making plans that stretched beyond their originally intended brief visit. Thunder's ears perked up at Mark's tone, as if he understood that these words meant they were staying. The bear's powerful body seemed to relax even further, settling into his position with an air of satisfaction. He had waited 4 years for this moment, and now his patience had been rewarded. Emily moved to sit near the door, close enough to feel Thunder's warmth, but maintaining the respectful distance they had always taught her to keep. The bear acknowledged her presence with a gentle rumble, his dark eyes watching as she pulled out her sketchbook. Another habit that hadn't changed. "With time, I used to draw him all the time," she said, pencil moving across the paper as she captured Thunder's massive profile. "But I never imagined he'd get so big. He's like a mountain himself now." Racel paused in her breakfast preparation to watch her daughter and the bear, struck by how the scene echoed countless mornings from years ago. Emily had grown from a child into a young woman, and Thunder from a vulnerable cub into a powerful adult. But the essential nature of their connection remained unchanged. The morning light strengthened, illuminating the clearing with an almost ethereal glow. Thunder's fur shone with health, his breath creating small clouds in the cool air as he maintained his vigilant watch. He was no longer just the orphaned cub they had saved, but something more. A guardian who had chosen to devote years of his life to keeping faith with the family who had once given him a home. The morning stretched into midday as the family settled, into a rhythm that felt both new and comfortingly familiar. Mark worked on the cabin's basic maintenance, checking pipes and fixing minor issues that had developed during their absence. Thunder maintained his position on the porch, his massive head turning to follow Mark's movements as he worked around the property. Racel ventured outside to clear snow from the old garden plot, remembering how Thunder used to watch her tend the vegetables years ago. The bear's eyes tracked her progress, his body shifting slightly to keep both her and the treeline in view. Despite his wild years, his protective instincts remained sharply focused on his reunited family. Emily had taken up residence on the porch itself, setting up her art supplies on the old wooden bench they'd left behind. Thunder's presence beside her created an almost comical contrast, her slender teenage frame dwarfed by his enormous bulk. Yet there was nothing threatening about the bear's posture. He lay with the same gentle patience he'd shown as a cub. "Look what I found," Mark called from the storage shed, emerging with Thunder's old feeding bowl, a heavy-duty steel basin that had once seemed comically large for the young bear. Now, comparing it to Thunder's massive head, it looked almost toy-like. The bear's ears perked up at the sight of it, recognition clear in his intelligent eyes. Racel watched as Mark rinsed the bowl and filled it with fresh water, placing it within Thunder's reach. The bear waited until Mark stepped back. Before lowering his head to drink, his movements still showing the careful manners they'd instilled in him years ago. It was remarkable how he'd maintained these learned behaviors despite living wild for so long. Mrs. Henderson said some of the hikers used to report seeing him fishing in the stream, Emily said, her pencil moving swiftly across her sketchpad. Said he'd gotten really good at it, could catch salmon when they were running without hardly getting wet anymore. The stream gurgled somewhere beneath the snow, its voice muffled but persistent. Thunder's ears twitched at the sound, and Racel wondered if he was remembering those early fishing lessons, how Mark had stood patiently in the water for hours, showing the young bear how to wait for the fish to come close. Mark paused in his work, leaning against the porch railing. The rangers kept tabs on him too, he added. Said he never showed any aggression toward humans, never raided campsites. Just kept his distance and came back here every evening. Pride mixed with lingering guilt in his voice. Pride in Thunder's gentle nature, guilt for the years of separation. The sun climbed higher, melting patches of snow and creating a gentle mist that rose from the forest floor. Thunder's fur steamed slightly in the growing warmth, but he showed no signs of discomfort or desire to retreat to the cooler forest. His vigilant watch continued, though his posture remained relaxed and content. Racel began preparing lunch inside the cabin, the now functioning stove making the task easier than their camping-style breakfast. The familiar domestic sounds seemed to please Thunder, whose eyes would occasionally drift to the kitchen window, nose twitching at the sense of cooking food. "I think we should stay," Emily said suddenly, looking up from her drawing. "Not just for a few days. Really stay." She glanced at Thunder, who rumbled softly as if in agreement. "He waited so long for us. We can't just leave him again." Mark and Racel exchanged looks, a silent conversation passing between them. They had discussed this possibility before making the trip, knowing that if Thunder was still here, still waiting, they couldn't bear to disappoint him again. The cabin needed work, and their city life would need rearranging. But the decision had really been made the moment they saw Thunder emerge from the forest. "The company's been wanting me to work remotely anyway," Mark said slowly, testing the words. "And your mother's writing can happen anywhere." He looked at Thunder, who met his gaze with those intelligent dark eyes. "Besides, I think we all know this is where we belong." Thunder's response was subtle but clear, a deep, contented rumble that seemed to resonate through the porch boards. Emily beamed, her face lighting up with joy and relief. Racel felt her own heart lift, knowing they were making the right choice. This mountain, this cabin, this extraordinary bear, it was all part of their healing, their story. The afternoon light softened as clouds began building over the peaks again. Thunder's nose lifted to test the air, his experienced senses reading the weather in ways they could only guess at. His calm demeanor suggested any approaching storm wouldn't match the intensity of the previous night. Emily moved closer to Thunder, still maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough to study the details she was sketching. The bear watched her work with apparent interest, his head tilted slightly as she captured his likeness on paper. His patience seemed infinite, his massive body perfectly still, except for the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "We'll need to stock up properly," Racel said, emerging from the cabin with sandwiches. "And there's so much to arrange back in the city." She handed plates to Mark and Emily, then paused, looking at Thunder. "But that's just logistics. The important thing is that we're home." Thunder's ears twitched at her voice, his eyes following the movement of the plates with polite interest but no demanding behavior. Somewhere in the forest, a bird called, and the bear's head turned slightly, assessing and dismissing the sound in the same smooth motion. His protective instincts never seemed to rest, even in moments of apparent relaxation. Mark settled onto the porch steps to eat, close enough to Thunder to reach out and touch him, though he respectfully maintained the distance. The bear's presence beside him seemed to ease something in his posture, smoothing away the hypervigilance that had marked his movements since returning from deployment. "I'd remember when he first started following you around," Emily said between bites. "Mum was so worried he'd get too dependent, wouldn't learn to be a real bear." She smiled at Thunder, who blinked slowly in response. "But he figured out how to be both, wild enough to survive on his own, but never too wild to forget us." Racel watched as a chickadee landed boldly on the porch railing, drawn by the crumbs from their lunch. Thunder tracked the small bird's movements, but made no aggressive motion, his behavior showing the same gentle restraint they'd worked so hard to instill in him as a cub. The afternoon continued to deepen, the shadows lengthening across the snow-covered clearing. Thunder's guard remained steady, his attention shifting between the forest, the family, and any small sounds that caught his interest. His presence felt like an anchor, grounding them all in this place that had once helped heal their broken pieces. Mark began making lists of supplies they'd need, repairs that would require attention, changes that would have to be made to accommodate. Year-round living in the mountain cabin, Thunder watched him work with apparent approval, as if he'd known all along that his patient vigil would eventually bring his family home to stay. The air grew colder as evening approached, but Thunder showed no sign of preparing to return to the forest as he had during his years of waiting. Instead, he seemed to settle more firmly into his spot on the porch, his huge body a living barrier between his family and the wilderness beyond. Emily continued her sketching until the light began to fade, her paper now filled with studies of Thunder's powerful form, his watchful eyes, his gentle expression. Each drawing captured something different about him, his strength, his patience, his unwavering loyalty. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, Racel watched Thunder's profile against the darkening sky, marveling at how this extraordinary bear had maintained such faith in their return. His years of waiting, his daily vigils, his gentle acceptance of their presence now, it all spoke of a depth of connection that defied easy explanation. The evening settled over the mountain like a gentle blanket, bringing with it a different quality of silence than they'd known in the city. Thunder's massive form remained a constant presence on the porch, his dark fur taking on silver highlights in the fading light. The bear's vigilant watch continued, though his posture held a contentment that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. Inside the cabin, Racel prepared dinner on the now fully functioning stove, the familiar sense of cooking filling the space with warmth and comfort. Mark worked on reinforcing the porch railings, the sound of his hammer punctuating the mountain quiet. Thunder watched him intently, occasionally shifting his bulk to give Mark better access to the areas that needed repair. Emily sat cross-legged near Thunder, updating her earlier sketches with the changing light and shadows. "Remember when he Used to try to help Dad with repairs, she asked, smiling at the memory. Always picking up tools and carrying them around like he thought he was a carpenter's assistant. Mark paused in his work, chuckling. Nearly lost my whole toolbox down the slope that one time. He was so proud of himself for organizing everything. He looked at Thunder, who rumbled softly as if sharing the memory. Now look at him. Probably weighs as much as my truck. The bear's eyes moved between them as they spoke, his intelligent gaze following their conversation. Despite his enormous size, there was still something of the curious cub in his expressions, the way he tilted his head to listen, how his ears twitched at familiar words. Racel appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. The rangers must have kept an eye on him all these years, she mused. I wonder what they thought, seeing such a huge bear acting like a faithful guardian, never causing trouble, just waiting day after day. Thunder's head turned toward her voice, his nose twitching at the cooking scents drifting from the cabin. His manners remained impeccable. No begging, no pushing forward, just that same patient presence they'd worked so hard to instill in him as a youngster. Mrs. Henderson said people used to drive up here just to see him, Emily added, shading. The area around Thunder's eyes in her sketch called him the Sentinel Bear. Some of them even started bringing offerings, honey, fish, berries, like they understood he was protecting something special. The light continued to fade, painting the snow-covered clearing in deep blues and purples. Thunder's attention shifted more frequently to the treeline now, his experienced senses reading the approaching night in ways they could only imagine. Yet there was no tension in his massive frame, no sign that he detected any threats in the gathering darkness. Mark finished the last of the railing repairs and began gathering his tools. We'll need to reinforce the whole porch eventually, he said, studying the structure. Make sure it can handle his weight long term. The words carried their commitment to staying, to making this place their home again. Thunder's ears perked up at that, and he made a soft, huffing sound that they remembered. From years ago, his way of expressing agreement. The bear had grown so much larger, but his personalities, his little expressions and sounds remained touchingly familiar. Racel called them in for dinner, the warm light from the cabin spilling out onto the porch. Thunder watched as they moved. Inside, his huge head turning to follow their movements while maintaining his guard position. The evening air grew colder, but his thick fur provided ample protection against the mountain chill. Inside, the family settled around the small table, the normality of sharing a meal feeling somehow extraordinary, with Thunder's silhouette filling the doorway. His presence completed something, bridging the gap between their past and present, between wilderness and home. Do you think he remembered everything? Emily asked, glancing at the bear. All the tricks we taught him? All the rules? She smiled, remembering the countless hours spent training the young Thunder, teaching him gentle manners and boundaries. Mark considered this, watching as Thunder adjusted his position to keep both the family and the forest in view. I think he remembered what mattered most, the trust, the connection. Everything else just stayed with him like muscle memory. Racel noticed how Thunder's ears twitched at certain words, how his eyes moved to whoever was speaking, following. The conversation with evident understanding. He had always been intelligent, but these years of independent survival seemed to have deepened his comprehension, his awareness. The forest beyond the clearing had fallen into darkness, but Thunder's posture remained relaxed and alert. His breathing created small clouds in the cooling air, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the pulse of the mountain night. "We should set up the trail cameras tomorrow," Mark suggested, his military training naturally turning to security measures. "See what kind of wildlife he's been dealing with out here." He looked at Thunder with respect, knowing that a bear of his size would have few natural challengers. Emily finished her dinner and returned to her spot near Thunder, pulling her jacket tighter against the evening chill. The bear acknowledged, her presence with a gentle rumble, his massive head turning slightly to keep her in view while still watching the darkness beyond. "It's like he never left his post," Racel observed softly, gathering the dishes. "All these years, just waiting and watching, keeping everything safe until we could come back." The thought carried equal measures of gratitude and gentle regret for the long separation. Thunder's response was subtle, a deep, quiet sound that vibrated through the porch boards, somehow conveying both contentment and reassurance. He had grown from their protected cub into a powerful guardian, yet maintained the loving heart that had first drawn them together. The night deepened around them, stars beginning to emerge in the clear mountain sky. Thunder's dark form seemed to merge with the shadows, only his eyes reflecting the cabin's light as he maintained his vigilant watch. His presence created a sense of security that went beyond physical protection. It was the safety of being truly home. Mark moved to check the generator one last time before bed, his footsteps crunching in the snow. Thunder's head turned to follow his progress, massive muscles shifting under thick fur as he adjusted his position. Every movement, despite his enormous size, still carried that careful gentleness they remembered. "Tomorrow, we should walk the property line," Racel suggested, watching Mark return. "See what's changed, what needs attention." She looked at Thunder, who rumbled softly at her words. "Though I have a feeling our guide here knows every inch of it by heart now." Emily yawned. The long day finally catching up with her, but her eyes kept returning to Thunder's impressive silhouette. "I still can't believe how big he got," she murmured, "but his eyes are exactly the same, still so gentle, so knowing." The bear's ears twitched at her words, and he turned his massive head to meet her gaze. In the dim light, his eyes held the same soulful intelligence that had first convinced them to save the orphaned cub, to make him part of their family. Now, after 4 years of faithful waiting, that connection had not only endured, but deepened into something extraordinary. Thunder settled more firmly onto the porch as they prepared for bed, his huge body positioned to guard their sleep just as he had guarded their empty cabin through countless nights of waiting. His patient vigil had finally been rewarded, and now he could truly rest, knowing his family had come home to stay. Mark woke before dawn, years of military service still dictating his internal clock. The first hints of morning painted the eastern sky in subtle grays as he moved quietly through the cabin, careful not to wake Racel and Emily. Thunder's massive silhouette remained at his post, his breath creating small clouds in the cold mountain air. "Morning, big guy," Mark whispered, pulling on his boots. Thunder's head turned toward him, eyes alert despite the early hour. The bear watched as Mark gathered his jacket and a small pack, seeming to understand his intention to explore the property. Thick snow crunched under Mark's boots as he stepped onto the porch. Thunder rose smoothly to his feet, his enormous frame moving with surprising grace. Without hesitation, the bear descended the porch steps, waiting patiently for Mark to join him. It was exactly how they used to begin their morning patrols years ago, though now Thunder's shoulders stood level with Mark's chest. Together, they moved into the barely lit forest, Thunder leading the way along paths he clearly knew well. The bear's massive paws left deep impressions in the snow, while his bulk easily pushed through the low-hanging branches laden with frost. Mark followed, noting how Thunder would occasionally pause, waiting for him to catch up. The property line had always been marked by old steel posts, many now weathered and leaning. Thunder moved purposefully between them, showing an uncanny memory of the boundary. Mark realized the bear had probably patrolled these lines countless times during his years of waiting, maintaining a territory that encompassed their old home. "You've been busy out here, haven't you?" Mark said softly, examining claw marks on several trees, territorial markings that would have warned other bears away from the area. Thunder rumbled in response, his breath steaming in the cold air as he watched Mark study his handiwork. The forest grew lighter as dawn approached, revealing more signs of Thunder's long guardianship. Well-worn paths wound between the trees, all eventually leading back toward the cabin. Here and there, Mark spotted places where the bear had clearly made his beds, circles of pressed vegetation under the protective branches of large pines. Thunder led him to the stream, now partially frozen, but still flowing strong beneath the ice. The bear moved carefully along the bank, showing Mark places where the water remained accessible. Fish bones scattered near certain spots testified to Thunder's successful hunting over the years. "Got better at fishing than me, didn't you?" Mark smiled, remembering the clumsy cub who had once splashed enthusiastically but ineffectively in the shallows. Thunder made a soft huffing sound, almost like agreement, before continuing along the stream bank. They came to a clearing Mark didn't remember, and Thunder paused, waiting. As the morning light strengthened, Mark saw what the bear wanted him to notice. Berry bushes, dozens of them, carefully maintained and protected from other wildlife. Some showed signs of recent browsing, explaining how Thunder had stayed so healthy through the winter. "You made yourself a whole garden out here," Mark said, amazed at the bear's resourcefulness. Thunder watched him examine the bushes, his intelligent eyes following Mark's movements. The bear had not just survived in their absence, he had thrived, creating a sustainable territory centered around the cabin he refused to abandon. The sun finally crested the mountain peaks as they completed their circuit of the property. Thunder moved with the confidence of long familiarity, showing Mark changes in the landscape, new game trails, areas where storms had brought down trees, places where the terrain had shifted over the years. Returning to the cabin, they found Racel on the porch, 2 steaming mugs in her hands. "Wondered where you two had gone," she said, handing one to Mark. Thunder climbed the steps with careful deliberation, resuming his post as if returning from a routine patrol. "He's been taking care of more than just the cabin," Mark told her, describing what he'd seen. "It's like he made himself caretaker of the whole property. You should see how he's maintained everything. The paths, the fishing spots, even a berry patch he cultivated." Racel watched Thunder settle into his usual position, his fur gleaming in the morning light. "All these years, we thought he was just waiting," she said softly. "But he was doing so much more. He was keeping everything ready for when we came." Back, Emily emerged from the cabin, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Did you go exploring?" she asked, noticing her father's snow-covered boots. Thunder turned his head toward her, making that gentle rumbling sound they all loved. "Your big friend here just gave me the grand tour," Mark replied, pulling out his phone to show her pictures he'd taken of Thunder's territory modifications. "He's been quite the groundskeeper while we were gone." The morning sun revealed more details of Thunder's nighttime vigil. The snow around the porch was marked with his massive tracks where he had made periodic circuits of the cabin, checking every approach. Despite his size, his movements had been so quiet none of them had heard him. Racel began preparing breakfast while Emily set up her art supplies, determined to capture Thunder in the morning light. The bear seemed content, his eyes half closed as the sun warmed his thick fur, though his ears remained alert to every sound from the surrounding forest. "We should document everything," Emily suggested, her pencil moving swiftly across her paper. "All the ways he's adapted, how he's maintained the property. It's incredible, like he knew exactly what needed to be done to keep everything ready for us." Mark nodded, still processing what he'd seen on their morning patrol. "The rangers would be interested in this. It's not just about a bear remembering his family. He's shown remarkable problem-solving skills, territory management, even environmental modification." Thunder listened to their conversation, his eyes moving between them as they spoke. Despite his years in the wild, his connection to them remained clear and strong. He was no longer just the orphaned cub they had saved, but a powerful adult who had chosen to maintain his bonds with humanity while mastering his natural environment. Morning progressed as Racel called them in for breakfast, the warm scents of coffee and cooking drawing them inside. Thunder maintained his watch, occasionally turning his massive head to check on them through the doorway. His presence felt both protective and nurturing, as if he was ensuring they settled properly back into the home he had guarded for so long. "Need to make some calls today," Racel said over breakfast. "Start the process of transferring everything up here." She looked out at Thunder, who rumbled softly as if in approval. "Though I have a feeling our guardian has already taken care of the hard part, keeping everything safe until we were ready to return." Emily finished her breakfast quickly, eager to return to her documentation of Thunder's changes to the property. The bear watched her gather her supplies with patient interest, his huge frame shifting slightly to give her better access to the porch while maintaining his protective position. Mark studied Thunder's profile against the morning light, seeing both the powerful wild animal he had become and the gentle soul they had always known. The bear had not just survived their absence, he had turned it into a mission, becoming guardian and caretaker of everything they had left behind. The sun climbed higher, promising another clear day in the mountains. Thunder's fur steamed slightly in the growing warmth, but he showed no sign of wanting to retreat to the cooler forest. His vigil continued, now enhanced by the joy of having his family finally home, where he had always known they belonged. The day unfolded with a steady stream of activity as the family began the process of making their return permanent. Racel spent the morning on her phone, coordinating with their city contacts while Mark catalogued the cabin's immediate repair needs. Thunder remained a constant presence, his massive form shifting occasionally to maintain the best view of both his family and the surrounding wilderness. Emily had taken to documenting everything about Thunder's behavior, her sketchbook filling with observations and detailed drawings. "Look how he always keeps the exit routes in view," she noted, watching as the bear adjusted his position when Mark moved to the far side of the cabin. "He's got the whole perimeter mapped in his head." Racel paused in her calls to watch Thunder's methodical movements. The bear's intelligence had always impressed them, but these years of solitary guardianship had honed his abilities into something extraordinary. His every action showed purpose, and careful thought. A deer appeared at the edge of the clearing, drawing Thunder's immediate attention. The bear made no aggressive move, but his presence alone was enough to send the deer retreating back into the forest. His territory management extended even to controlling which wildlife ventured too close to the cabin. "The moving company can come next week," Racel announced, finally finishing her calls, "though we'll need to drive back to the city for a few days to pack everything properly." She glanced at Thunder, wondering how he would react to another temporary separation. The bear's ears twitched at her words, his dark eyes moving between family members as they discussed the logistics. There was an almost human quality to his attention, an understanding that seemed to go beyond mere animal intelligence. Mark approached Thunder slowly, crouching near the massive bear. "We're not leaving for good this time, buddy," he said softly. "Just a few days to get everything sorted. Then we'll be back for keeps." Thunder rumbled deeply, his eyes fixed on Mark's face with evident comprehension. Emily set aside her sketchbook, concern crossing her features. "But what if he thinks we're abandoning him again? What if he doesn't understand we're coming back?" The worry in her voice reflected their shared guilt over the previous 4-year separation. Thunder shifted his weight, the porch boards creaking under his enormous bulk. His behavior had changed subtly as they discussed leaving, not distressed, but more alert, more focused on their movements. It was as if he was already preparing for another vigil. "Maybe one of us should stay," Racel suggested, watching Thunder's reactions. "Keep him company while the others pack up the city house." The bear's ears perked up at this, his attention sharpening as they discussed the possibility. Mark nodded slowly, understanding the importance of maintaining their renewed bond. "Emily could stay with me. We can work on the cabin repairs while you handle the packing." He looked at Thunder, who seemed to relax slightly at these words. The bear's intelligence showed clearly as they continued planning. He listened intently to their discussion, his eyes moving between speakers, his body language responding to the tone and content of their words. 4 years of solitary waiting had only enhanced his ability to understand human interaction. Racel began preparing lunch, while Emily and Mark continued documenting Thunder's territory modifications. The bear maintained his vigilant watch, but his posture held none of the tension it had shown when they first discussed leaving. He seemed to understand this separation would be different. Mrs. Henderson said he was always calmer when people talked to him, Emily recalled, sketching Thunder's profile in the midday light, like he was listening for familiar voices, trying to understand what everyone was saying. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow as Mark worked on reinforcing the porch supports. Thunder watched the repairs with evident interest, occasionally shifting his weight to test the strengthened boards. His careful movements showed remarkable awareness of his own size and impact on the structure. A call from the ranger station brought new information about Thunder's years of waiting. The local wildlife officers had maintained a detailed log of his activities, amazed by his consistent behavior and gentle nature. They had never seen anything quite like him. A wild bear choosing to remain so connected to human structures while maintaining perfect boundaries. "They want to study him," Racel reported after hanging up. "Document his behavior as an example of unique ursine intelligence and social bonding." Thunder's ears twitched at her voice, though his attention remained divided between the family and his surroundings. Mark emerged from under the porch, dusting off his hands. "As long as they understand he's not just a research subject, he's family." The bear rumbled in agreement, his massive head turning to follow Mark's movements with obvious affection. The wind shifted, bringing new scents from the forest, and Thunder's nose lifted to read the air. His behavior was a constant reminder that, despite his gentle nature with them, he remained a powerful wild animal, fully capable of surviving in his mountain environment. Emily moved closer to Thunder, still maintaining a respectful distance. "Do you think he knows how special he is?" she wondered aloud. How different from other bears. The bear's dark eyes met hers, holding that same soulful intelligence that had first drawn them to the orphaned cub years ago. Racel watched their interaction, remembering how tiny Thunder had been when they first found him. Now his massive frame dominated the porch, his presence both protective and nurturing. He had grown into something extraordinary, a bridge between their world and the wilderness. The afternoon wore on as they continued preparing for the upcoming move. Thunder remained attentive to their activities, his guard never wavering despite the peaceful day. His years of waiting had instilled a patience that seemed limitless, yet his attention never dulled. Mark finished the last of the porch repairs, testing the reinforced structure. This should hold him now, no matter how big he gets. Thunder rose to his feet, moving carefully across the strengthened boards, as if demonstrating his approval of the work. The sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Thunder's fur took on golden highlights. In the evening light, his powerful form silhouetted against the darkening forest. His presence felt more settled now, as if their discussions of returning permanently had eased some lingering uncertainty in his mind. Emily completed her final sketch of the day, her pages filled with observations about Thunder's behaviors and habits. The bear had proved to be an endless source of fascination, each hour revealing new aspects of his remarkable intelligence and adaptation. Night settled over the mountain with a gentle hush, the stars emerging one by one in the clear sky. Thunder's massive form remained vigilant on the porch, his dark fur blending with the shadows, while his eyes reflected the warm light spilling from the cabin windows. The evening had brought a sense of peace, of rightness, as if the last puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. The small living room glowed with the warmth of the newly checked fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Racel sorted through old photographs they'd found in a drawer, memories of Thunder's early days, with them preserved in faded prints. "Look at this one," she said softly, holding up a picture of the tiny cub attempting to climb onto Mark's lap. Emily leaned closer, comparing the image to the enormous bear now guarding their door. "It's hard to believe he was ever that small," she marveled, glancing at Thunder, who turned his head at the sound of their voices, his eyes fixed on the photographs with evident interest, as if he too remembered those early days. Mark joined them, his hands still dusty from the day's repairs. "Found something interesting in the shed," he announced, producing a battered leather collar. Thunder's first, long, outgrown. The bear's ears perked up at the sight of it, his nose twitching as Mark held it out. "He wore it for what, maybe 6 months?" Racel recalled, watching as Thunder studied the old collar. "Until he started growing so fast, we worried it would get too tight." The bear made a soft sound, almost like a sigh, as if sharing in the memory. The night deepened around them, but Thunder showed no signs of his old pattern of departing at sunset. Instead, he seemed to settle more firmly into his position, his massive body blocking most of the doorway. During his years of waiting, he had always returned to the forest after dark, Now, he appeared determined to maintain his guard through the night. Emily worked on organizing her day's observations, creating a detailed record of Thunder's behaviors and habits. "The rangers will be amazed by all this," she said, reviewing her notes. "They've never seen anything like him, a wild bear who's maintained such strong human connections while surviving completely independently." Thunder's ears twitched at her words, his attention divided between their conversation and the sounds of the night forest. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shift of wind through the trees registered in the subtle movements of his head, the focusing of his eyes. Racel began preparing for bed, laying out sleeping bags since they hadn't yet arranged for furniture delivery. The bear watched their evening routine with apparent satisfaction, as if pleased to see them settling into the home he had guarded so faithfully. "I've been thinking," Mark said, his voice thoughtful as he studied Thunder's profile. All those years, he wasn't just waiting. He was keeping everything ready, maintaining the property, protecting our place here, like he knew someday we'd understand and come back. The bear's deep rumble seemed to confirm Mark's words. Thunder had done more than survive in their absence. He had appointed himself guardian, not just of the cabin, but of the possibility of their return. His patient vigil had been an act of faith as much as loyalty. Outside, an owl called from the darkness, its voice carrying clearly in the still night air. Thunder's head turned toward the sound, assessing and dismissing it in one smooth motion. His protective instincts never seemed to rest, even in moments of apparent relaxation. Emily spread her sleeping bag near the fireplace, positioning herself where she could see Thunder through the doorway. The bear acknowledged her choice with a gentle rumble, adjusting his position slightly to maintain a clear view of her resting place. "We should set up the trail cameras tomorrow," Mark suggested, checking the cabin's locks out of habit though. Thunder's presence made such precautions seem almost redundant. "Document his patrol patterns, see how he's been protecting the property all this time." Racel nodded, remembering the ranger's interest in Thunder's unique behavior. "It would help others understand what he's accomplished here, not just surviving, but actively maintaining a connection to both worlds, wild and human." Thunder listened to their conversation, his intelligent eyes moving between speakers. The firelight caught the silver tips of his fur, creating an almost mythical appearance. He had grown from their rescued cub into something extraordinary, a guardian who had chosen to devote his life to protecting the place where he had first found love. The night grew deeper, and Emily's sketching gradually slowed as tiredness overtook her. Thunder watched as she finally set aside her materials, his massive head turning to follow her movements as she prepared for sleep. His protective instincts seemed especially focused on her, perhaps remembering the small child she had been when they first found him. Mark made one last check of the generator before settling into his own sleeping bag. The bear's presence created a sense of security that went beyond physical protection. It was the comfort of being watched over by someone who had proven their absolute dedication. "Do you think he slept out here every night?" Racel wondered aloud, watching Thunder's silhouette against the starlit sky. "All those years, just keeping guard over an empty cabin." The thought carried both admiration for his loyalty and a touch of sadness for the long solitude he had endured. Thunder's soft rumble seemed to answer her question. His massive frame shifted slightly, settling more firmly onto the porch boards, as if to emphasize his commitment to his chosen post. The years of waiting had not weakened his resolve. If anything, they had strengthened his determination to protect what he considered his family's home. Emily's voice came sleepily from her. "Sleeping bag? He's not going to leave tonight, is he? Not like before." She looked at Thunder, who met her gaze with gentle reassurance in his dark eyes. "No, honey," Mark answered, understanding in his voice. "I think those days are over. He's not just guarding an empty cabin anymore. He's protecting his family." The bear rumbled in agreement, his massive head turning to scan the darkness beyond the clearing. Racel watched as Emily finally drifted off to sleep, her face peaceful in the dying firelight. Thunder's attention remained divided between the sleeping girl and the night beyond, his guard unwavering. He had grown so much larger than they remembered, yet his heart seemed to have grown even more. The cabin creaked softly as it cooled in the night air, a sound that had once been lonely but now felt comforting under Thunder's watchful presence. The bear's breathing created a steady rhythm, a counterpoint to the gentle whisper of wind through the pines. Mark and Racel exchanged glances, sharing a moment of quiet amazement at the miracle of Thunder's dedication. The bear they had saved had repaid their kindness 1,000 times over, maintaining unwavering faith through years of solitude. Now finally reunited, he showed no interest in returning to his wild solitude. The night deepened towards midnight, stars wheeling slowly overhead. Thunder's vigilance never wavered, his massive form a living shield between his sleeping family and the wilderness beyond. He had waited so long for this moment, to be able to truly protect them, to have his patience and loyalty rewarded with their permanent return. Racel finally settled into her own sleeping bag, the events of the day catching up with her. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Thunder's silhouette, steady and strong, guarding their dreams, just as he had guarded their empty home through 4 long years of faithful waiting. The first morning light crept gently across the mountains, finding Thunder still at his post, his massive body blocking most of the doorway. He had maintained his vigil through the night, moving only to make periodic checks around the cabin's perimeter. His dark eyes held no trace of weariness, despite the long watch, alert and focused as the day began to unfold. Inside the cabin, Mark stirred first, his military training still governing his sleep patterns. He found Thunder's gaze already fixed on him, the bear's ears twitching in quiet acknowledgement. Through the window, fresh tracks in the snow showed Thunder's nighttime patrol routes, methodical circles around the cabin, each pass bringing him back to his post at the door. Racel woke next, moving quietly to start coffee on the camping stove. Thunder's nose lifted at the familiar scent, his massive head turning to track her movements through the cabin. His behavior showed the same careful attention they remembered, though now scaled to his enormous adult size. He really didn't leave. "Once all night," Racel whispered to Mark, watching as Thunder adjusted his position to better see Emily's sleeping form near the fireplace. The bear's protective instincts seemed to focus especially on the teenager, perhaps still seeing the small child who had once played under his watchful eye. Emily finally stirred, blinking sleepily in the early morning light. "Thunder," she called softly, and the bear immediately rumbled in response, his dark eyes gentle as they met hers. The bond between them remained unbroken, strengthened rather than weakened by the years apart. The morning began to take shape around them as the family started their preparations for the day ahead. The Rangers would be visiting later, eager to document Thunder's extraordinary behavior and intelligence. The bear seemed to sense the importance of the coming meeting, his movements deliberate and calm as he watched them get ready. "We should show them his territory modifications first," Mark suggested, reviewing Emily's notes from the previous day. The berry garden, the fishing spots, all the ways he's maintained the property. Thunder's ears twitched at the mention of his achievements, his attention focused on their discussion. Racel began preparing a more substantial breakfast now that the cabin's utilities were fully functioning. The familiar domestic sounds seemed to please Thunder, whose eyes occasionally drifted to the kitchen window, nose twitching at the cooking scents. Emily set up her documentation materials on the porch, careful to maintain the respectful distance they had always taught her to keep. Despite Thunder's gentle nature, they never forgot that he was a wild animal, powerful and deserving of space. The bear watched her work with apparent interest, his massive head turning to study her drawings of him. The morning sun strengthened, melting frost from the trees and creating a gentle mist that rose from the forest floor. Thunder's fur steamed slightly in the growing warmth, but he showed no discomfort. His focus remained sharp, divided between his family's activities and the surrounding wilderness. A vehicle's distant rumble announced the ranger's approach before it became visible. Thunder's ears perked forward, but his body remained relaxed. He had grown accustomed to occasional visitors during his years of waiting. 2 Forest Service trucks appeared at the end of the drive, moving slowly to avoid startling the massive bear. Rangers Miller and Chen emerged from their vehicles, their movements careful and professional despite their obvious amazement at Thunder's size. The bear watched them approach, his posture remaining calm but alert as they joined the family on the porch. "Remarkable," Ranger Miller breathed, studying Thunder's relaxed yet vigilant stance. "We've tracked him for years, but seeing him like this, actually interacting with your family, it's extraordinary." The bear's eyes moved between the rangers, assessing them with clear intelligence. Emily proudly shared her documentation, pointing out Thunder's various behavioral patterns and territory modifications. The rangers listened intently, their professional interest obvious as they took notes and photographs. Thunder observed it all with patient dignity, occasionally turning his head to scan the forest beyond the clearing. "We've never documented anything like this," Ranger Chen admitted, reviewing Emily's sketches. "A wild bear choosing to maintain such close human connections while remaining completely self-sufficient in the wilderness. He's basically created his own unique role as a bridge between 2 worlds." Mark led them on a tour of Thunder's territory, the bear following at a respectful distance. His presence seemed to both protect and guide them, showing the rangers how he had maintained trails and marked boundaries during his years of waiting. Every aspect of his behavior demonstrated remarkable intelligence and purpose. "Look at how he's modified these game trails," Ranger Miller noted, examining Thunder's careful maintenance of the paths. "He's actually created a network that all leads back to the cabin, and these markings he's been actively discouraging other bears from the area, protecting your property even when you weren't here." Thunder moved ahead of them occasionally, showing them specific features of his territory. The fishing spots he'd perfected, the berry garden he'd cultivated, the sheltered dens he'd created for winter use. Each discovery added to the ranger's amazement at his adaptability and intelligence. Racel watched from the porch as Thunder guided the group, his movements confident and purposeful. "He's proud of what he's accomplished," she observed softly. "All these years, he wasn't just waiting. He was building something, maintaining everything for when we returned. The morning stretched on as the rangers documented Thunder's extraordinary achievements. They photographed his territorial markings, recorded his interactions with the family, and marveled at his gentle yet protective nature. The bear participated with patient tolerance, seemingly understanding the importance of their work. This could change how we understand bear intelligence and social bonding, Ranger Chen said, reviewing their morning's observations. He's demonstrated levels of planning and attachment that we didn't think were possible. Thunder watched them, discuss his capabilities, his dark eyes holding that same thoughtful awareness that had first drawn the family to him as a cub. Emily continued adding to her documentation, capturing new details of Thunder's behavior as he interacted with the rangers. His responses to their presence showed remarkable social understanding, maintaining appropriate distances, moderating his movements to avoid causing anxiety, demonstrating his intelligence without any signs of aggression. The sun climbed higher. As the morning progressed, warming the mountain air, Thunder made periodic checks of the property's perimeter, always returning to his post near the family. His patrols showed the same methodical care the rangers had observed in his territory maintenance. Every movement had purpose, every action showed thought. "We'd like to set up some long-term observation equipment," Ranger Miller suggested. "If you're comfortable with that. Nothing invasive, just cameras to document his continued development." Thunder's ears twitched at their discussion, his attention focused on the conversation, though his guard never wavered. Mark nodded, understanding the scientific value of Thunder's unique behavior. As long as it doesn't interfere with his routine or make him uncomfortable. The bear rumbled softly, as if appreciating Mark's concern for his well-being. His intelligence continued to impress everyone who encountered him. The rangers began making plans for their documentation project, discussing camera placements and observation schedules. Thunder listened to their conversation with apparent interest, his head tilting slightly as they pointed out potential monitoring locations. His awareness of their intentions seemed almost human in its complexity. Racel called everyone in for lunch, the domestic routine continuing despite the morning's excitement. Thunder resumed his post by the door, watching as they shared their meal and discussed the implications of his extraordinary behavior. His presence completed their family circle, bridging the gap between their human world and his wild nature. "He's created something entirely new," Ranger Chen observed, watching Thunder's careful interactions with the family. "Not quite wild, not quite tame, but something uniquely his own. A guardian who chose to maintain his connections to both worlds." The bear's deep rumble seemed to acknowledge her words, his intelligent eyes meeting hers with calm awareness. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clearing as the rangers prepared to leave, their notebooks filled with observations and their cameras loaded with documentation of Thunder's extraordinary behavior. The bear watched them pack their equipment, his massive frame still positioned protectively near the family, while maintaining a respectful distance from the visitors. "We'll be back next week to set up the monitoring equipment," Ranger Miller said, glancing admiringly at Thunder. "Though I have a feeling he'll know exactly where every camera is within hours." The bear's ears twitched at his words, his intelligent eyes showing that familiar awareness that continued to amaze everyone who encountered him. Racel and Emily stood on the porch as the rangers' trucks disappeared down the mountain road, the sound of engines fading into the peaceful afternoon. Thunder remained alert, his nose testing the air as if ensuring the visitors had truly departed. His protective instincts never seemed to rest, even during the most peaceful moments. "They're going to write papers about him," Emily said proudly, adding final notes to her own documentation, about how he's changed what we know about bear intelligence and social bonds. Thunder turned his head toward her voice, rumbling softly as if acknowledging her words. Mark began preparing for their temporary return to the city, gathering the essential items they would need for packing up their old home. Thunder watched these preparations with careful attention, his body language showing none of the tension it had displayed during their previous departure discussions. "Just a few days," Racel reassured him, noticing how his eyes tracked their movements. "We'll be back before you know it, and then we'll be here for good." The bear's response was a deep, gentle sound that seemed to convey understanding. He had waited 4 years. A few more days would not shake his faith. Emily sat close to Thunder, still maintaining the safe distance they had always taught her to keep. "Will you keep taking care of everything while we're gone?" she asked softly. "Like you did before?" The bear's dark eyes met hers, holding that same soulful intelligence that had first drawn them together. The afternoon light softened as clouds began building over the peaks, promising more mountain weather. Thunder's nose lifted to test the air, reading the signs of approaching snow. His years in the wilderness had honed his natural instincts while maintaining his gentle connection to the family he had chosen to protect. The rangers said they've never seen anything like his territory management, Mark observed, watching Thunder. "Scan the tree line. The way he's created safe paths, maintained boundaries, even cultivated food sources. It's like he designed everything around the cabin, keeping it as the center of his world." Racel began packing their temporary supplies, each movement watched by Thunder's attentive gaze. "He turned waiting into something productive," she said softly. "Instead of just surviving, he created something meaningful. A safe haven ready. For when we returned, the bear's massive head turned toward the forest as a deer appeared at the edge of the clearing. Thunder made no aggressive move, but his presence alone was enough to send the deer retreating. His authority in his territory was absolute, yet always exercised with remarkable restraint. Emily continued her sketching, trying to capture every detail of Thunder's behavior before their brief separation. "Do you think he'll remember everything? We've taught him about the cameras?" she asked, watching him test the air. "About not interfering with them, letting the rangers document him." Mark smiled, noting how Thunder's ears twitched at their discussion. "I think he understands more than we realize. He's shown incredible adaptation to human activities over the years." The bear rumbled softly, as if agreeing with this assessment of his capabilities. The afternoon began to fade as they finished their preparations for departure. Thunder maintained his vigilant watch, his massive frame a constant presence that had become essential to their sense of home. His patient dedication had transformed the cabin from a temporary refuge into something permanent and meaningful. "We should mark the calendar," Racel suggested. "Make sure everyone knows when we'll be back permanently." Thunder's attention focused on her words, his intelligent eyes following her movements as she made notes. Even after 4 years, his understanding of human communication remained remarkable. Emily gathered her documentation materials, carefully organizing her observations of Thunder's behavior. "The rangers said they've never seen a bear maintain such consistent patterns," she noted, reviewing her notes. Most wild animals adapt and change their territories, but he kept everything centered around waiting for us. Thunder shifted his weight on the porch, the boards creaking softly under his enormous bulk. His presence had become so natural, so essential to their experience of the cabin, that the thought of even a brief separation felt strange. Yet his calm demeanor suggested complete confidence in their return. "We'll need to get proper supplies for him," Mark said, making additions to their shopping list. Something more substantial than the temporary food station the locals set up. Thunder's ears perked up at this discussion, though his attention remained divided between the family and his surroundings. Racel watched as the bear made another careful check of the property's perimeter, his movements showing the same methodical care they had observed throughout their reunion. "He's not just guarding the cabin anymore," she observed. "He's protecting our future here, everything we're building together." The sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Thunder's fur took on golden highlights in the evening light, his powerful form silhouetted against the darkening forest. His patient vigil would continue, but now with the certainty of their permanent return. Emily moved closer to Thunder, speaking softly to him about their plans for permanent residence. The bear listened with apparent understanding, his gentle eyes fixed on her face as she detailed their intentions. His intelligence continued to amaze them, bridging the gap between human and wild in ways they had never imagined possible. "Tomorrow morning," Mark said quietly, watching Thunder's protective attention to Emily. "We'll head out early, get everything sorted as quickly as possible." The bear's ears twitched at his words, but his body remained relaxed, showing none of the anxiety they had feared.